As much as Berserk is the story of Guts, Griffith, Casca, and everyone in their lives, it would not be half as effective if it did not have the Apostles in it. These demonic entities, who used to be human at one point in their lives, are what have come to define Guts' war against the Inhumans as his primary victims. From the first page of the Black Swordsman chapter to the last page of the most recent chapter 371, Apostles and their pseudo-minions are everywhere in Berserk's story, but not all of them have had the same kind of impact as the ones on this list. We've already done a video about the top Apostles and God Hand members in Berserk, but we have never ranked the latter's demonic subjects properly. So, here it is. These are the top 20 Apostles and Pseudo-Apostles in Berserk, explored. Also, before we begin this video, we'd just like to tell you that this list is ranked in terms of the amount of impact we think a particular Apostle or Pseudo-Apostle has had on the story. Before we get into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Snake Lord. Luckily, for those of you who loved Guts' Edgelord era, his first proper opponent was a great way of introducing Berserk's readers to the character of Guts, and the nature of his enemies in general. Though he technically wasn't the first Apostle Guts killed chronologically, and we'll get to her in a bit, the job of explaining what an Apostle actually is would fall on the shoulders of the Snake Baron. In the 1997 Berserk anime, he was technically merged with another character we will speak of in a bit, so let's talk about him first. He technically debuted in the same forest where Casca and Guts consummated their relationship, albeit 3 days before said consummation took place. But his real-world debut was in the Black Swordsman chapter. After killing the female apostle and avenging Corcus, #Corcus was a good guy all along, Guts arrives in the walled city of Coca, where the atmosphere is more tense than usual. Women and children are being rounded up in carriages and sent to the castle. The streets are filled with mercenaries, and the thugs in service of the castle's ruler are harassing both patrons and elves in the town inn. Guts saves the last of them from the thugs, and after giving us a taste of his skill with the Dragon Slayer, tells the survivor to give a message to his master. The Black Swordsman had arrived in Coca City. The guy shuts up and does as he is told, which is when we get our first glimpse of the Snake Baron. The reptilian demon is doing a quintessentially Apostle thing when the mayor of Coca City arrives to beg for his own life, enjoying a meal of man-flesh. The mayor tries to put the blame for the inn incident entirely on the Black Swordsman's shoulders before making a plea for mercy for his citizens, but mostly for himself. The Snake Baron knows this, however, and his attitude towards the mayor's request is something that is, once again, baseline for most Apostles in the series: apathy and complete disdain towards humanity. The Baron reveals to the terrified mayor that the only thing he truly cares about is not tribute or gold, but slaughter and gluttony. He delights in crushing humans and then finishing off the leftovers, because that is the true nature of an abominable Apostle. We get to see this nature in effect firsthand when Snake Baron attacks Coca City in order to flush out Guts. His men commit innumerable atrocities against the very citizens they're supposed to be defending, but the Baron's cruelty proves that he is inhuman. The Snake Baron is how we know Apostles are insanely durable, because even after taking a face and torso full of crossbows from Guts, all he did was laugh like a maniac. In his transformed state, he looked like a massive snake-like kaiju, whose face was a disgusting mix of a serpentine tongue and a you-know-what. In this hideous released form, his power was such that a single blow from his tail was enough to crush the organs of a normal human, and 3 strikes meant certain death. Guts nearly found this out personally, and he would have as well, had the Snake Lord not fallen prey to the #1 weakness shared by most Apostles of his level: vanity. Being reincarnated humans with the power of evil surging within their bodies, Apostles are basically continents above mankind in every facet of physical strength and agility. Their monstrous appendages give them a better slaughtering range than most humans, and the fact that their bodies are nearly immortal would have made them an endless nightmare for mankind, had nearly not been the keyword in that phrase. As the Snake Baron taunts a heavily wounded Guts with his own mortality and reminds him of his place in the food chain, he eats a face full of cannon fire that opens him up to a bisecting blow from Dragon Slayer. The hunter becomes the hunted, and turns out the Black Swordsman is a pretty sadistic predator. He plays with his prey as he interrogates the Snake Baron about the God Hand's position, and this teaches us 2 things. Number 1, low-ranking Apostles were basically buffoons when it came to the higher mysteries, and number 2, the Snake Baron Baron was present at Guts' eclipse, because as soon as the Snake Baron sees that brand of sacrifice, a flash of recognition crosses his face, and we learn later that he too was involved in that infernal feast. It's very brief, but in Chapter 80, we get a glimpse of an apostle with a snake's head chomping its jaw down on one of the members of the Band of the Falcon. This means that Guts was 2 for 2 in his revenge quest within the first chapter of Berserk itself, and if you ask us, that's pretty amazing progress for a day's work. Sonia's Friend. Berserk is a story that began in 1989. Over its 3-decade-plus journey, Kentaro Miura has explored as many character dynamics as he could for all of the players in his story, and the same goes for Apostles. After Femto's incarnation into the physical world in the form of Griffith, he became a magnet for Apostles all over the world. The inhuman reincarnations flocked to his banner like moths attracted to light, and were divided into special divisions of war demons, each under the supervision of a legendary apostle. For the first time in world history, humanity and Apostles, 2 beings that should repulse each other, were working together. But that doesn't mean everything was as cooperative as Griffith made it seem. Apostles were inherently debauched creatures, born of infernal sacrifices and existing for the sole purpose of consuming everything human in their sight. To expect that they will fight alongside humans and never try to, say, turn them into a meal, is a pipe dream of the highest order. Case in point, the apostle that we are choosing to call Sonia's Friend. When Mule Wolfflame is introduced to Griffith's reborn Band of the Falcon, Sonia guides him through their encampment so he can fulfill his desire and meet Griffith in person. On the way, she decides to take a shortcut, and the pair end up entering the resting grounds of the war demons. Mule can immediately sense the apostles' inhuman nature just by the sheer bloodlust their presence gives off, but even if Sonia could sense it, she couldn't be bothered with it. She chose to stroll through the middle of the war demons' camp in order to get to Griffith, which is when she was picked up by an apostle that looks a lot like a goblin. This apostle commends Sonia's bravery for walking amidst the war demons unprotected, and then licks her face, commenting that he hadn't tasted human flesh in quite a while. Sonia manages to scare him straight by bringing up Griffith, and Grunbeld's arrival further ensures that the scene doesn't turn ugly. But make no mistake, this apostle was planning to eat the medium of the Falcon. It was only because Grunbeld and Irvine were keeping watch over their master's guests that Sonia and Mule remained unscathed. The medium of the Falcon promised her new friend that she would bring him a corpse when she came here the next time, and this is where he becomes relevant to our list. Miura was clearly building up to an event where Griffith's apostles would no longer be able to restrain their hunger for their preferred flesh type, and would end up feasting on Falconians, in what could become the demonic ritual to end all demonic rituals. Sonia and Shirke are friends, and if we are correct in assuming that her apostle friend is the same one who wanted to eat guts at Vertanis' harbor, then he has also most likely seen Shirke. The kite and the owl are destined to meet again, but it will probably be on opposite sides of the battlefield. If Sonia's friend is asked to attack the Black Swordsman party, what is to say he won't take the initiative and get himself a woman's cadaver? The real kicker would be if he goes for the kite's owl friend. After all, that is why he's on the list. Unidentified Female Apostle. If you stopped reading Berserk after reading the first couple of pages, then you'd have thought it was a story about a succubus hunter, given the fact that, technically, Guts was sword deep in one in the manga's very first panel. This is during his initial years as the infamous Black Swordsman, when Casca was still stuck in her regressed mental state, and Guts was at a point in his life where he cared more about killing than loyalty. All he wanted to do was make it through the night and kill his next target as soon as possible, so it makes sense that that is exactly how we were introduced to him. But enough about Guts, let's talk about this apostle instead. As Guts plays plumber beside a campfire, the beautiful woman who had been clutching his mechanical arm out of ecstasy a moment ago now grabbed him across his waist with sinister intentions. We said you'd have thought that Berserk was a story about succubi if you stopped reading after the first 2 pages, because Guts' gorgeous dancing partner transforms into a hideous monstrosity of a demon. Now, usually, if you're in an intimate scenario with another person, and that person turns into a literal demon, screaming your throat sore would be your first reaction. But Guts is not one of the normies. Instead of panicking for his life like a normal person, he tells the apostle that the one who is trapped is her, before blowing her up with his arm cannon. All of this happens in the first 2 pages of Berserk, mind you, so you can see why we said we were worried that you might think this wasn't a story about the struggler. Within a short span of time, her existence made us understand the nature of apostles, Guts' mission, and the Black Swordsman's current mindset. Miura retroactively turns Guts' first kill on paper into vengeance, because as it turns out, this was the apostle that killed Corcus during Griffith's eclipse. As the Band of the Falcon's self-aggrandizing unit commander witnessed his comrades being slaughtered by the apostles gathered for that infernal feast, his mind started rejecting reality as a way of coping with the stress. Corcus went into a state of delirium, where he thought his entire life after joining the Band of the Falcon had been a dream. And to him, the eclipse was like being in the worst part of a nightmare. The appearance of this apostle in her human form seems to confirm his thought process, because Corcus had established himself as a pervert before the eclipse, and only his sick brain could think of a woman at a time like this. But it turns out that his feet were still carrying him through a nightmare that felt surreal, but was, in fact, actually happening. The female apostle seduces Corcus before devouring him. Guts getting revenge for the guy who treated him like crap in the opening sequences of Berserk makes him a nice guy in our opinion, and not the demon-hunting monster that Miura makes him out to be in the Black Swordsman arc. Roaming Apostle / Keeper of the Hounds. The only reason this apostle ranks this high on our list is because he was the first victim of Guts' one-man war against demonkind. And the 2016 anime gave him a decent enough backstory for us to sink our teeth into. The roaming apostle shows up in chapter 93, having tracked Guts from the eclipse to Godot's hut with the intention of finishing off the leftovers from that nocturnal feast. His release date is that of a hideous bulldog with tusks like an elephant, 2 faces, and 4 arms. The roaming apostle wastes no time with chit-chat and gets to attacking his meal, but Guts is far too good of a swordsman for him to handle personally. The Hound Apostle ends up becoming the first canonical target of Guts' Dragon Slayer in the manga, and that's about as far as his story goes. The 2016 anime decided to merge his role with another apostle we will talk about in a few minutes, and it places him in the path of Guts and Farnace as the former escaped from the Holy Iron Chain Knights. In the show, the apostle is called the Keeper of the Hounds, and in his human life, that's exactly what he was. He was an ugly-looking human being who had no social interactions with any living beings except for his hounds, whom he loved. One day, as he was being mistreated by a nobleman, the keeper was saved from his daily agony by a young lady. This lady took him on as the keeper of the hounds at her father's mansion, and from that day onward, he loved her like an angel. The keeper was so infatuated with the count's daughter that he asked her out, but she obviously rejected him, so he ended up sacrificing her to the God Hand instead. The Keeper of the Hounds keeps the upper half of her sacrificed body preserved in the mansion where he rules now, as a sick memento of a distant memory. When Guts and Farnace arrive at the mansion, Farney is able to get away from the Black Swordsman thanks to the Keeper's hounds, but unfortunately for her, she gets out of the storm and falls into a lava pit. As she tries to get as far away from Guts as was humanly possible, Farnace bumps into the Keeper and immediately starts commanding him to help her make her escape. She promises to reward him, of course, but the Keeper had another kind of prize on his mind, salivating at the prospect of having a noblewoman again. Ironically enough, it is the man that she was trying to escape from who ends up saving her life, because had Guts not shown up when he did, Farney would have been a digested appetizer by now. The battle between the Keeper of the Hounds and the Black Swordsman is a combination of 3 different sequences from the manga. Number 1, Guts' fight with the Snake Baron. Number 2, his flight from the Holy Iron Chain Knights. And number 3, his encounter with a certain slimy count and his daughter. That last one will be explained in just a bit, but if you know the results of the first 2 sequences and have been paying attention to everything we've said so far, you know how this entry ends. The Keeper of the Hounds was killed without mercy by the Black Swordsman when he realized that the Apostle did not know where the God Hand was. The 2016 anime gets a lot of things wrong, but we have to commend them for managing to pull off such a condensed retelling of events in such an impactful fashion. Zondark. We've spoken so much about apostles, it's about time we addressed what a pseudo-apostle is. A pseudo-apostle is basically what the name suggests, an artificially created apostle-like being. These demonic thralls do not have to go through the process of obtaining a behelit and sacrificing those who define their humanity in order to transcend said humanity. They receive their powers from an apostle who has already ascended, but in exchange, they are bound to that apostle's will. This might not be true for every pseudo-apostle, but it is true for the very first one we ever saw in the series, Zondark. Zondark is the captain of the guards of a nameless city where the Black Swordsman has arrived looking for its apostle ruler. Guts interrupts a heretic execution and openly taunts his target with the threat of death in a heavily populated public plaza. He is rewarded for his boldness with a private escort of city guards, only they weren't exactly friendly towards him. The Black Swordsman repaid their frankly terrible hospitality with a slasher few from Dragonslayer. After taking out a dozen lackeys, he's faced by what feels like a real challenge in Zondark. a hulking brute of a warrior who brandished a massive warhammer as his weapon of choice. Zondark looked down on Guts from his face-like visor and mocked the Black Swordsman by praising his ability to fight with such a massive sword. He wished to test its capabilities against his warhammer, which was capable of cracking open a cobblestone pavement. Zondark had a wild, out-of-control fighting style that even put his subordinates at the risk of death, but it became clear soon enough that his booming declarations about Guts' fighting ability were empty boasts, and nothing more. The Black Swordsman used Zondark's own logic against him, and used Dragonslayer to break the Captain of Guard's warhammer and helmet. A piece of the helm flew into Zondark's eye, and the added humiliation of Guts stepping on his head and mocking him in turn was enough to prime the captain for becoming a pseudo-apostle. When he returns to fight Guts, he is far more threatening as an opponent. Zondark, having received a portion of his Apostle Master's powers, was capable of producing long, slimy appendages which were bladed, like a parasite from Parasite. His speed, agility, and strength were all at a different level compared to when he was a human. Zondark could fling his tentacles at Guts with such speed that the human eye couldn't keep up with his movements, and if the Black Swordsman hadn't been a genius swordsman, he'd have been sliced into ribbons instantly. Thanks to his master's regenerative powers, the only way to finish off Zondark was by going for the head, so that's exactly what Guts ends up doing. After reaching the Apostle Ruler's castle, he has a final showdown with Zondark, where he takes the proverbial hat off the pseudo-apostle and then decimates the actual apostle's manifestation. Although he wasn't a full-fledged demon reincarnate, Zondark was our first example of just how lethal even artificial demons can be, because the wounds he gave Guts required immediate medical attention, and that is doing a lot of damage to someone who once slew 100 knights by himself with no help or medical assistance. Slug count. Now that we've touched on the first pseudo-apostle of Berserk, let's talk about the guy who made him, shall we? The Slug Count is an apostle whose existence showed us just how masterful Miura's storytelling abilities are. So far, you have only heard of the acts that apostles commit after having reached their ascended state, but until we saw the Slug Count's backstory, we never understood why. And once we did, we wished we could forget it just as quickly. See, we tend to think that only those who harbor great evil in their hearts and express it by harming others can become apostles, but Miura was letting us know from the very beginning that it goes deeper than that. Things like good and evil are subjective, and they dwell within a person's heart simultaneously, locked in a never-ending struggle for a person's soul. The Slug Count used to be a devoted ruler and family man before he became a demon. Yes, he was strict, and his idea of justice was about as lenient as Stannis Baratheon's. But even the people who despise him now remember a time when he would truly do what he did for the good of his people. As an apostle, the Count had started using heretical inquisitions as an excuse to stockpile more humans for his appetite. His former physician, Vargas, reveals the nasty truth about the Count's experiments, and if you saw the panel where he turned Zondark into a pseudo-apostle, you would understand why his character is not present in any anime adaptation of Berserk. Yet, at the same time, his backstory is so tragic that you can't help but feel for him. The reason the Count became an apostle wasn't because he craved more power or wanted to fully give in to the evil in his heart, it's because he couldn't handle his despair. The man had a beautiful wife, and together they sired a daughter, whom they both loved very much. Yet, despite being a heretic hunter by oath, he failed to recognize the one dwelling in his own castle. When he returned from a particularly grueling campaign, the Count discovered his wife hosting a massive pagan gathering, and that is what sealed his fate. He murdered everyone else in the room, but couldn't bring himself to kill the woman he loved. And to make things worse, she knew it. In that despair, the Count tried to take his own life, but was instead met by the God Hand and granted his heart's deepest desire. The Count sacrificed his wife in exchange for never-ending life, but that is not the only reason he's so high on our list. The Count is also the first apostle to have defied the God Hand by refusing to sacrifice his daughter Teresia and ascend a second time. He chose to end up going into the abyss by himself, and yet the damage he had inflicted upon his people could never be undone. The Slug Count is the perfect representation of the kind of dichotomy Berserk likes to hit its readers with. Because he is definitely evil, but you understand and maybe even empathize a little bit with the reasons behind it. And that is the real scary part. The Great Goat. Speaking of the Slug Count, ever since we saw that massive goat-headed pagan statue in Guardian Angels of Desire Part 5, we were wondering if Miura would bust out an actual goat-headed demon at some point in the story. So imagine our delight when we saw that the guy in charge of the heretical cult that Nina was a part of loved to cosplay as Baphomet for his family. The Great Goat's introduction is perhaps the most debauched of any pseudo-apostle in the story. He is first seen giving and receiving pleasure from multiple women as he sits in a quasi-meditative position, sporting a mask that is near identical to the statue Teresia's mom was worshipped. Though he doesn't speak a word during this entire time, it's clear that the Great Goat is overseeing the heretic's carnal activities and keeping a close eye on its development. He was prepared to give Joachim his blessing to join the cult when the prospective convert approached him with Nina. The Great Goat muttered a few esoteric words, had Joachim kiss his heart and his member, and just like that, the latter was now a heretic. In hindsight, we should have known this guy would become an apostle when the Great Goat's little goat appeared serpentine to Joachim. The latter did the sensible thing and made a break for it when he realized his girlfriend's cult were also practicing cannibals, and he would return with the Holy Iron Chain Knights the next time we saw him. With the Great Goat's sights set upon mingling with Casca, Isidro perched in an eagle's nest with his sniper stones, and Farnace's men approaching the site of pure sin, chaos was bound to be unleashed. So it didn't surprise us when several malign dead spirits possessed the cultists and caused them to begin slaughtering everything in sight indiscriminately. The Great Goat tried to make a break for it in the ensuing chaos, but was struck in the chest with a weird tentacle that turned his goat mask from temporary to permanent. The next time he was seen on the pages of Berserk, the Great Goat looked more like a satyr, because he had now become a pseudo-apostle. His speed and strength had increased exponentially, and his member was actually serpentine now that he joined the ranks of demonkind. The Great Goat remained fixated on mating with Casca, and would have gone through with it too had Guts not arrived in the nick of time. The Black Swordsman engaged the pagan apostle, but the Great Goat proved too much to handle initially. His hooves and horns made him such a problem that had Guts not been wearing Godot's armor, his spine might have been crushed underneath goat feet. The Great Goat's agility as an apostle was so great that Guts couldn't pin him down even with an improved version of his mechanical crossbow. In the end, it was a gamble with Rickert's newly made mini-bombs that brought down the Great Goat, as the explosion made him slow down just enough for Guts to bisect him with Dragonslayer. In the end, we find out that this cult leader and pseudo-apostle was nothing but a balding old lecher who loved doing a little pagan cosplay from time to time, or at least that's what we inferred from the dead body Guts left behind. The Great Goat was a good filler pseudo for Guts to take down as he worked on his real goal of recovering Casca, but we think Miura-sensei had more fun tying his character design back to something he showed us at the start of the story. Grunbeld. At number 9, we have the Flame Dragon Knight, the apostle who towers over all apostles, the guy who arguably has a cooler canon in his character design, Grunbeld himself. Grunbeld is the first apostle on our list who is a unit commander in the reborn Band of the Falcon, and there's a reason for that. Like most of the characters you've seen on the list so far, Grunbeld too sacrificed someone to become the demonic powerhouse he is today. The big difference is that he used to be a legendary warrior even before that, and it shows in his reincarnated self as well. Grunbeld was from a small northern Holy See territory called the Great Principality of Grant. As a young noble from a declining house suffering from what seems to be gigantism, he faced a lot of discrimination from his peers and had a lot of expectations saddled on him from his parent. Yes, parent singular, because his dad died during his infancy, and his mother raised him to be a proud warrior and aristocrat whose destiny was to die in battle. Grunbeld technically grew up in enemy territory, as he was raised under the conversion program of the Tudor Empire, but he managed to stay true to himself and even made a couple of friends in Sigar and Edvard. He eventually helped drive the Tudor out of his own lands, and rose to lead his own unit of warriors called the Grunbeld Brigade. The Flame Dragon Knight would be ridden into battle on a mighty chariot owing to his towering frame, but neither chariot nor warhammer could save him from the destiny causality had picked for him. Grunbeld was betrayed by his closest friend, Edvard, and forced to face off against hundreds of Tudor soldiers all alone. He managed to hold them off pretty well, until the cannons got involved. Even then, Grunbeld repelled the first cannon blast shot in his direction, but his human body gave up soon after that. In his despair, the behelit he had picked up earlier in life activated, and he sacrificed those who defined his human soul in exchange for rising from the ashes as a literal flame dragon. With scales made out of corundum and a colossal body that was capable of shooting fireballs upon his enemies, Grunbeld was practically indestructible. So, after he avenges the Tudor abuse of his lands, the Flame Dragon Knight joins Griffith's reborn Band of the Falcon at Shet, and is named the commander of the Giants unit. He's quite similar to his compatriots in that he wants to willingly serve and impress the Falcon of Light, but he is dissimilar in that he follows a warrior's code. In his first encounter with Guts, he treated his fight with the Black Swordsman like a duel, right up until Berserker Guts sunk Dragonslayer into his right shoulder. The Apostle then assumed his released form and became the only actual dragon that Guts' iconic sword has gone up against so far in the story. As of now, Grunbeld remains in Falconia, assisting Griffith with his vision for the new world. He was last seen witnessing the Falcon of Light's arrival with Casca in chapter 371. So far, his fight with Guts has seen him incur a massive gash across his corundum-scaled face, but we're waiting for the inevitable round 2 to see if Godot's masterpiece can really slay dragons or not. Wyald, enjoyment and excitement. How bad could the pursuit of such positive experiences really be? That question is answered rather graphically by the one apostle we will never recommend makes it into any anime adaptation. Wyald, as his name suggests, is a wild man. He's introduced drowning in a sea of flesh, taking the pleasure he needs from the women he is with without any regard for their own satisfaction or even their lives. Turns out, he's part of an order of knights composed entirely out of former criminals and thugs, and the King of Midland had ordered him to present Griffith's head at court. Even in the company of the scum of the earth, Wyald stood a cut above all his men and had such an inhuman presence that they followed him out of pure fear. I mean, we figured there was something wrong with the guy when he volunteered for the Black Dog Knights, but we knew for sure when we saw how Wyald treated the family who helped the Griffith rescue team on their way. As an apostle, he had the immense strength and physicality that is typical to demon kind. During his showdown with Guts, the 100-man Slayer could tell Wyald had no formal training because of his fighting style, but was shocked that he could keep up with him with nothing but a damned club. His shock turned into horror and then rage, because after Guts drew his first ounce of blood from Wyald, the apostle transformed into his released state. He grabbed Casca and was about to give her a preview of what waited for her during the eclipse when Guts managed to seemingly kill him off. The 100-man Slayer takes down Wyald with a savage stab to the head, running his greatsword straight through Wyald and incapacitating the ape-like monster. Yet somehow, Wyald still had one last wind in him, and he used it to take Griffith hostage. Wyald knew Griffith was about to join the God Hand, and so he wished to use the Crimson Behelit and save his own life instead. But this is where he made his biggest mistake, because the man who had told Wyald about the White Falcon's demonic fate is the one who gave him his end. As Wyald prepares to end Griffith after realizing he doesn't have the Behelit on him, the Immortal One appears out of nowhere and immediately ends Wyald's life instead. The apostle whose motto was to enjoy and excite dies, feeling neither emotion. The leader of the Black Dog Knights was such a menace to everyone around him that so far, he's the only apostle to be killed by another apostle. And if that doesn't give you the common sense to turn around and run at top speed when you see the banner of the Black Dog Knights, we don't know what will. Emperor Ganishka. Not every apostle prefers acting like a knave in the presence of a superior existence. Some apostles have led rather egotistical lives as human beings, and because apostlehood is basically an amalgamation of all the worst things about a person, they tend to carry over those personality traits into their second lives. Locus, Grunbeld, Irvine, Rakshas, these are all examples of apostles who, despite being reincarnated demons, are still true to their human selves, which is probably why they display more restraint from your average apostle. But they were all killers with glorified job descriptions. The subject of this entry had ascended the throne of his people a long time before he ever became a demon. Born into the Kushan royal family as the firstborn son, Ganishka's life was already decided for him. He was meant to ascend the Kushan throne and rule over all his subjects for as long as his human life permitted. There was only one problem. No one really wanted to see him become king. When he was 6, his own mother tried to kill him so his younger brother could become king instead. When he came of age, every courtier tried to either curry favor with him or cut his legs from underneath him, because they all knew who he was meant to be. Even his father looked at him with more fear than pride, and so Ganishka systematically eliminated every viper in his den before taking over. As emperor, he devoted his entire life to conquest, rarely visiting his family and only focusing on expansion as a means to abate his own fears. But Flora once said that karma is a spiral, and Ganishka feels the effect of that spiral when he returns home from a long campaign and is attacked at the victory feast by men loyal to his own son. As the great emperor found himself breathing his final breath, he realized he wanted to live beyond his mortal flesh, and the behelit in his possession activated upon being drenched in his blood. Ganishka sacrificed those closest to him in order to become the strongest apostle to show up in Berserk so far, and he continued his quest for world domination with a renewed zeal. Because he had been a ruler before his ascendance, Ganishka refused to cleave to Griffith after he incarnated into the physical world, and to be honest, he did have the chops to seriously cripple the Falcon of Light's forces. To call Ganishka's apostle form massive would be an understatement. The Dread Emperor used water and wind elementals to create his released state, which looked and behaved like a giant thundercloud when at full power. He could use this fog to blanket cities and entire coastlines in his ode, and Ganishka's association with Daiba gave him access to all kinds of demonic soldiers. Though he preferred using Daka and Pishacha to achieve his clandestine goals, Ganishka had no qualms with unleashing his own lightning upon his enemies, which was powerful enough to cook several apostles into a burnt crisp. The Dread Emperor was practically untouchable due to these factors, because how exactly do you kill something you can't even touch? Turns out the answer was aiming Dragon Slayer at the middle of his brow, but even that pales in the face of what Ganishka ended up becoming. After being brought to his knees by Griffith at Vertanis, the Dread Emperor decides that drastic measures were needed if he wanted to secure a W against the Falcon of Light. The only way he thought it would be possible was by reincarnating once again, and so Ganishka did the unthinkable. He lowered himself into the man-made behelit. The fog, which blanketed Wyndham and doubled as his own body, was sucked into the demon womb, along with every bit of organic life touching it, including the apostles that made up the behelit itself. Ganishka's ego sunk into the very depths of the astral world and rose from within it as a Shiva, the beast of the end. In this form, the Dread Emperor became a mindless eldritch monstrosity, whose first act was to crush his own soldiers to death and respawn them as demonic pseudo-apostles. The sheer scope and scale of Shiva's existence drove Ganishka insane, and instead of attacking Griffith, he started craving the Falcon's light. When Daiba tried to reason with him, Ganishka rained hellfire on the former city of Wyndham, and the only thing that stopped his onslaught was the arrival of Femto himself. The God Hand used his position as Ganishka's natural superior and manipulated the spatial strike sent his way by the Skull Knight to trigger the great roar of the astral world by splitting the Dread Emperor's heads in two. The great Ganishka's legacy still stands in the New World, as his dead body became the World Spiral Tree, which is most likely the only thing keeping Berserk's world in a state of fantasia. His introduction was late, and his appearances were far and few in between. But Ganishka's impact on the story is undeniable, which is why he ranks this high on our list. But you will notice that despite calling him the strongest apostle in all of Berserk, we've placed him at number 2. That's because power, like importance, is a subjective metric, and since we're basing this entire list off the latter category, there really was no other choice for number 1 than the Immortal One himself. Zodd. From the beginning of Guts' story with the Band of the Falcon to the latest chapter where Griffith returns to his capital city of Falconia, one apostle has defined the existence of his entire species, and that's the Immortal One, Nosferatu Zodd. Revered as a god of the battlefield, Zodd has been active as an unrivaled warrior for 300 years before he crossed paths with the Black Swordsman. His immense lifespan was a consequence of his ascension into apostlhood, but the Immortal One was unlike any apostle we had met up until his introduction to the series. The female apostle, the Snake Baron, and even the Slug Count were unapologetic demons who delighted in torturing humans to the brink of insanity, and then eating them for kicks and giggles. Zodd, on the other hand, was discarding the bodies of the Band of the Falcon members he had slaughtered because gluttony and sadism was just not his thing. The only thing that the Immortal One desired was to face an opponent as strong as himself, or even stronger. He shows extreme melancholy at his own power and the fact that it has taken away his ability to savor battle to the fullest. Oftentimes, he would wipe out entire armies without even needing to transform into his released state, and just when you thought he had finally died, he would re-emerge on some other battlefield halfway across the world after a period of dormancy. He was so strong that the only person who had given him a fight he could actually enjoy was Skull Knight, whom he calls his eternal rival. so we can understand Zodd's excitement when he finally met a human who could not only keep up, but also managed to seriously injure him. But Zodd's inclusion in the story goes beyond simply having an uber-strong demonic underling for our protagonist to finish off during his story's climax. Nosferatu Zodd is one of the only apostles who has been shown to be able to perceive the flow of causality, at least to some degree. He warned Guts of the fate that awaited him after glimpsing Griffith's behelit, and he was mostly right. He was the one who informed his fellow apostles about the arrival of the fifth Blessed King, and his identity as the current White Falcon. When Femto was preparing the world for his eventual incarnation in a body of flesh, Zodd was the only apostle he personally appeared to in order to recruit him. When the Immortal One realized that his left horn had been sliced off his head, even in a dreamscape, he realized he had finally found his desired one, and made his way to St. Albion in order to pledge himself to Griffith. Today, he is the Falcon of Light's personal mount and foremost war demon, as Zodd is always involved in all of Griffith's plans. He was the one who led the attack on Flora's mansion, the one who saved Princess Charlotte from her prison, and the one who carried Femto to Shiva's colossal head to help him trigger the great roar of the astral world. Zodd is clearly linked to the more esoteric happenings of Berserk's unique world, but ultimately, as a warrior, his destiny seems to be dying in battle against a worthy opponent. Just who that opponent will be is the question that remains. The obvious answer would be the Skull Knight. Zodd and the foe of the Inhumans have tangled against one another many a time in the former's 300 years as an apostle, but he has never found an opponent like him. Nosferatu Zodd is a being that only cares about one thing: finding and fighting the ultimate strong one. He has faced both humans and apostles in his long peregrination, but so far, only Skull Knight has been able to match him in a fight. We've never seen the pair actually fight each other. Every time an encounter between Skull Knight and Zodd is queued up, something more important happens, and both characters end up reacting to it instead of shredding each other apart. This feels like a setup for a final climactic showdown between the two, and while that is still possible, a better candidate might be Guts. The Black Swordsman and the Immortal One have fought twice, and each time it was a forced stalemate. According to Sonia's prophecies, Zodd and Guts' fates are linked, and given that round 3 is practically inevitable, it is also possible that Guts will get to Zodd before Skull Knight. There are a lot of possibilities with this character, and that is why Zodd is at the top of our list of apostles and pseudo-apostles in Berserk. Sirenhead Apostle. This apostle is already dead, but he's on the list for 2 reasons. Number 1, his visage is still burned into Casca's mind even after it was restored, and number 2, he killed Berserk's original best boy Judo. There is no given name for it, and it only appeared in like half a dozen panels at best, but the impact left by the Sirenhead Apostle cannot be denied. We call it Sirenhead because its body vaguely resembles that of the infamous meme monster. This apostle is massive and black, with 2 eyes on its torso and 2 on each half of its yin-yang face. Emerging from the center of said face was a mouth that shot out whip-like tendrils, which Sirenhead could use at astonishing speeds. In Storm of Death Part 2, after Judo and Casca fall off their half-devoured horse, Sirenhead approaches them, brandishing his tentacles like omens of death. It was going to go for Casca first, but Judo jumped in front of her and bit that bullet for the woman he secretly loved. Sirenhead went to town on Judo's back and ripped it to shreds before landing a lethal blow that pierced through his chest. The best member of the Band of the Falcon used his final throwing knife to blind his killer, and Casca finished the apostle off for him. But the Sirenhead's job there was done. He had imprinted himself within the branded girl's subconscious as the killer of the man who saved her from guaranteed death, and she was reminded of him when she spoke to Guts after waking up from her regressed state. She wanted to talk to him, the man she loved, the man who protected her when she couldn't do it herself. But when she spoke to him about Isidro and how he reminded her of Judo, Sirenhead popped up in Casca's mind and brought her screaming to her knees. To say that she hasn't moved on from the eclipse would be an understatement, but the reason this apostle is on our list goes beyond him killing Judo and traumatizing Casca, although they are the primary reasons. Sirenhead is a representation of the eclipse, and everything horror that came with it within Casca's mind. And now, she's been brought to Falconia, a city that is guarded by some of the same apostles who devoured her comrades at Griffith's eclipse. How will she deal with her new reality once she wakes up from her slumber? And will she be able to get Sirenhead out of her own head? Only time and Studio Gaga can tell. Rosine. Let's pose a question. Do you think children can be inherently evil? We're not talking about those kids who were born with or form mental health issues early on in their lives. Do you think that humans, who are still forming their worldview and trying to separate right from wrong within their heads, can be capable of performing evil deeds? We tend to think that apostles are apostles because they possess the character traits for it in their human lives. But really, the reason why a person transforms into a demon isn't malice, it's despair. And despair is a universal emotion capable of being perceived by humans at varying stages of life. Even teenagers. This is why Rosine is probably the most terrifying and tragic apostle on our list. As a young girl living in the same village as Jill, Rosine grew up in an extremely abusive household. Her father would often inflict physical and verbal abuse upon her and her mother, because when Rosine's village was attacked during a conflict, her mother was violated by some soldiers, and Rosine's father could never accept her as his own child as a consequence. She would spend her days roaming in the woods just to stay as far away from her home as she could, which is how she became friends with Jill. Rosine would often compare herself to the outcast called Pecaf from her village's fables, but eventually she came to truly believe that she was Pecaf himself. When the situation with her father deteriorated to a point where she couldn't take it anymore, Rosine left to find the elves of the Misty Valley and take her place amongst them. Instead, she ended up unknowingly sacrificing her parents to the God Hand to be reincarnated as an elf-like apostle. Rosine made her debut in the story when she and the Slug Count decided to snack on Rickard's unit before joining the Eclipse's feast. After partaking in the infernal nocturnal banquet, she went back to terrorize the villages around the Misty Valley with her elves and guardians, who were really pseudo-apostles sired from children and adults respectively. There is a reason why both adaptations of Berserk showed Rosine, but stopped short of actually adapting the Lost Children arc. And if you want to know why, go check out her Origins video on our main channel. There are 2 reasons why Rosine is so high on our list. Number 1, she is the only child who ascended to apostlehood in the official Berserk canon, and number 2, her showdown with Guts was a great reminder of just who the Black Swordsman truly was. After introducing Guts as a nihilistic, cares-for-nothing protagonist in the Black Swordsman arc, Miura-sensei ended up sensitizing his character a lot during the Golden Age, to the point that even his Berserk acts during and immediately after the eclipse didn't even register as being disturbing to the readers. What reconnected him to the Black Swordsman from the first Berserk chapter was Rosine. Guts' feral, fiery fighting style and do-or-die attitude helps him defeat an apostle who can break the sound barrier, but the fact that he wanted to finish her off despite knowing Rosine was mortally wounded is what made him scarier than any apostle in the moment. Rosine was a great medium for expressing the tragedy and terror that seems to pervade the background of most characters in Berserk, and if you still don't get why we say this, go read the Lost Children arc and judge for yourself. Man-made behelit. Okay, so before you revolt against us in the comments section, yes, we know that the man-made behelit was an artifact, but technically it's made out of the bodies of apostles, and they're still alive right up until the moment they get sucked into a miasma of overwhelming evil. So, you know, potato potato. The man-made behelit is exactly what it sounds like. It's a device that replicates the effects of a behelit, but has not been sent forth from the astral world. The man who made this behelit was an aged Eastern sorcerer sadhu called Daiba. If you want to know exactly how he came up with the idea for an apparatus like this, go check out his origins on our channel. For this video, let's just say that a lifetime of practicing sorcery and wishing for the rise of a magical empire had given Daiba enough knowledge about the astral world for him to recreate the effects of one of its strongest objects. The man-made behelit is gigantic. Its scale is so massive that Daiba had to keep it inside the biggest pantheon in Wyndham City because it wouldn't fit anywhere else. As we've mentioned already, it is made from the stitched together bodies of apostles who were still living even as their bodies had been split asunder. The panels that Miura gives us showing their state within the behelit are disturbing enough to give all 3 Human Centipede movies a run for their money. These apostles have tubes attached to their mouths and other orifices, which connect to a massive tank which is constantly filled and refilled with amniotic fluid. When pregnant women are lowered into the tank, the essence of evil being released into it from the apostles' living bodies surges into their wombs and brings forth the demon spawn known as Daka. This process must have been repeated thousands of times, because by the time the man-made behelit arrives in Midland, Daiba has already raised a massive army of Daka soldiers. The reason why the man-made behelit has been included on this list is twofold. Number 1, it's obviously because of its link to the astral world and its behelit behelit-like functions, but number 2, it's probably the only hive-like organism we've seen in Berserk, and it is composed entirely out of apostles. I mean, don't get us wrong, those guys are not having fun if the panels depicted in chapter 233 are anything to go by, but they also form the only composite organic structure in the entire series that isn't the blood flow of the dead. The man-made behelit is also called the demon womb, and that makes sense because its primary function is to act as a birthing chamber for the Daka. If you think about it a certain way, then the man-made behelit is the only apostle we've seen actually give birth in the series. Every other apostle, even the female ones, seem to have an incubation process for their creations that are independent of their bodies. Look at the slug count in Rosine for the best examples. But the Daka are birthed from the amniotic fluid that is not only filling the tank, but also the apostles who form said tank. The mothers of the Daka receive a mixture of regular amniotic fluid and apostle-tainted amniotic fluid when they are lowered in the vessel, which is why their fetuses end up mutating into demon babies. The man-made behelit's existence in Berserk came to an end when all the apostles that composed it were sucked into a single entity who should not have been entering it in the first place. The power and the evil of all the apostles who were living a tortured life thanks to Daiba surged into this one being, who ended up becoming the bringer of the end of the world. So when you take all these factors into account, you start to see why we've placed this apparatus on our list. The man-made behelit never hurt anyone in and of itself, but the creations it spewed forth were crucial to the Kushan invasion of the world, and the behelit itself would end up giving us the strongest apostle we've ever seen in Berserk. Borkoff. If Guts' entire journey is motivated by revenge, then there isn't a single side encounter that can top the reunion between these two in our eyes, because the Black Swordsman is going to want to pay Borkoff back for the arm he took from him. When Borkoff debuted in the manga, he was just a nameless apostle. He was the salamander-looking guy who chomped down on Guts' left arm to hold him in place as his apostle brethren prepared to violate and devour Casca. Their advances were halted in their tracks by the emergence of the 5th Demon King, and Borkoff found himself a part of the first act of his new divine ruler following Femto's birth. He kept his jaws clamped tightly around Guts' left arm as the god hand violated Casca in front of him, and when he felt it slip, Borkoff chewed into it to lock it in place. Guts tried to free himself by striking Borkoff's mouth with Gaston's sword, but the apostle's hide was so thick that the blade broke. The Black Swordsman was forced to use the broken shard to give himself a ruthless amputation, but even that wasn't enough. Griffith simply summoned more apostles to hold his old comrade down as he finished up. Once he did, Skull Knight broke into the interstice and rescued Guts and Casca, and we thought we'd never see Borkoff again, until he showed up to serve his master who had been incarnated into the physical world. Like most living apostles, Borkoff was drawn to Femto's physical incarnation as Griffith, and he pledged his life to the Falcon of Light's reborn Band of the Falcon. Borkoff became a member of Sir Locus's War Demon Lancer unit, and was seemingly used as the Moonlight Knight's greatest shock troop. He was seen slaughtering multiple Daka with his massive jaw when the Falcon's vanguard infiltrated Windham on a rescue mission. Once Locus's diversion had succeeded in allowing Griffith to rescue Charlotte from her chambers, he commanded Borkoff to create an escape route, which the Apostle did by smashing through Windham's walls and buildings like a battering ram. The Salamander Apostle then showed up at the fight outside of Britannis, when Griffith set the date for the end of the world with Ganishka, and then at the event itself. Borkoff was at ground zero for the Great Roar of the Astral World, and he was the vessel for us understanding just how apostles were going to coexist with humans in the city of Falconia. When Rickard arrives at the Falcon's castle for an audience with Griffith, he is met by Locus instead, who leads him to the War Demon's permanent dwelling within Falconia, Pandemonium. Inside, the War Demons participate in gladiatorial matches against other fantastical beasts of the world in order to keep their bloodlust sated, and the man giving Rickard a demo on this very fact is none other than Borkoff. The apostle defeats and devours an ogre as the former Falcon watches the results of his former leader's sacrifice, and this is why Borkoff is so relevant to the series. Miura-sensei rarely named apostles, so when he does give an apostle a name, especially retroactively, it makes you sit up and take notice. Borkoff and Guts have unfinished business, and with Casca's arrival at Falconia, it appears as though the Black Swordsman is about to collect on a debt long overdue. Father Mozgus and his disciples. Starting off our top 10 is a guy you might be surprised to see this low on the list, but we'd like to remind you that Father Mozgus was just a pseudo-apostle, and his impact on the story has already been sealed. The Bloody Inquisitor made his debut during the Conviction arc, and quickly proved that he didn't need to have evil surging through his veins to commit heinous crimes. What made it even more unsettling was that he did all that he did with the full conviction that he was acting upon God's will. So it makes sense that when Mozgus was turned into a pseudo-apostle, he would think his transformation to be part of divine providence. As the blood flow of the dead threatened to devour every living thing within the Tower of Conviction, Mozgus beseeched his disciples to not fear this test from God and to meet it with his holy wrath instead. He was so caught up in his own fanatical fury that he failed to notice the tentacles that struck him and all 6 of his disciples, turning them into pseudo-apostles that represented the dichotomy of the God-Hand's existence. Mozgus and all of his disciples were granted angelic wings with which to perform their holy task. The Father himself claimed to have witnessed a miracle and declares burning Casca his life's greatest mission. All 7 of them had gained immense strength, speed, and the ability to fly thanks to their ascensions. But even then, Mozgus was a cut above. For starters, he was granted the power to spit flames from his mouth, an ability he named God's Breath, and in his transformed state, he looked like the definition of a demon being confused for an angel. Mozgus's released pseudo-apostle form covered him with rock-hard scales that gleamed white like enamel. It turned his wings into massive fists and turned his boiling temper into a raging volcano. Seriously, had Guts not noticed the one chink in Mozgus's armor that he created at the beginning of the fight, recovering Casca and ensuring she stayed with them would have been a lot harder for the Black Swordsman party. But this isn't the only reason why Mozgus ranks so high on our list. When Farnace and Shirke enter the Corridor of Dreams in order to help Casca regain her sanity, we see that one of the things protecting the former's astral self is a washing stone that resembles Mozgus's face. Farnace summons this rock to protect herself and her mistress on at least 2 occasions as they traverse the tortured dreamscape that was Casca's reality. Mozgus's impact on the story goes beyond him being a facilitator for the incarnation ceremony. He has become a literal bedrock for Farnace's subconscious mind, and it will be very interesting to see how that comes into play in Berserk's final act, if it does at all. Irvine. What happens to a hunter who spends all of his time isolating from society and pursuing the thrill of the hunt? He becomes an apostle, apparently. Out of all the advanced apostles in Griffith's service, Irvine is perhaps the most mysterious. He debuts as a silent specter of death who likes to cosplay as Robin Hood or something because his skills with a bow were unparalleled. Irvine was able to decapitate Kushan soldiers with his arrows, which, when you realize what he was using as projectiles, feels like the awesome feat of strength and accuracy that it is. As the leader of the War Demon's archer unit, Irvine's squad was never far from the action. He himself would often form the crux of Griffith's ambush tactics. His pinpoint accuracy and ability to conceal himself until the last opportune moment made him the best long-range fighter in the reborn Band of the Falcon by far. But it was his friendship with Sonia that really made us get into him as a character. The campfire conversation this pair of outcasts have about their respective lives leading up to joining the Falcon of Light shows you just how alone they have both been throughout their lives. In his human life, Irvine was a master marksman and a skilled minstrel, but it was the hunt that consumed his life. He would get so lost in hunting that before long, he lost track of when he himself became a beast. Once he had become an apostle, there remained no place for him in the world of man, except as a beacon talon for the prophesized Falcon of Light. Irvine's apostle form is one of the most unique character designs in all of Berserk. In his released state, his upper body grows thick fur and antlered horns like a satyr's, but his lower body morphs into a wolf-like beast with the horns of a stag and a single eye in the middle of its head. Irvine could use the fur from his tail as arrows and the horns on his wolf head as a bow to turn his own body into a lethal scorpion, which we think is the singular most effective use of an apostle design we've seen in Miura-sensei's masterpiece. From the way he's depicted in the story, you'd think that he is a truly benevolent apostle, but then Rickert sees him hunting a cockatrice on his way to Falconia, and we are reminded that no matter how slick Irvine's human form is, he is an apostle at the end of the day. Irvine's story seems to be closely linked to Sonia's, which is why it was interesting to see he was the one guarding her in chapter 371 and not Mule. Clearly, Miura-sensei set up their dynamic as a way to shatter either one of their beliefs about the new world they find themselves in. We just hope Mori-san doesn't drop this storyline when his team resumes publishing Berserk. Rakshas. From an apostle we kind of don't want to see die, to an apostle we very much want to see die. At number 7, we have the Bakiraka clan exile, Rakshas. Most apostles cleave to the God Hand members out of a primal instinct. Whenever they're in the presence of one, they instinctively feel a maddening sense of reverence well up within the core of their beings. Rakshas is not unique in this regard, because he too finds the Falcon of Light undeniably magnetic. What makes him unique is that, unlike other apostles, the only reason he agrees to serve Griffith is because he wants to be the one who kills him. Rakshas is odd, even for a demonic entity. He grew up alongside Silet, but was exiled from the Bakiraka clan for his gross tendency to revel in his missions. The primary aim of a Bakiraka assassin was to administer death, not to toy with it, and stretch it out for one's own amusement. Apparently that was exactly the kind of thing Rakshas liked doing in his human life, so it makes sense that this guy ended up becoming an apostle. What makes his character even more engrossing is the fact that he's one of 3 apostles to have an entirely non-human base form. The first one we've already spoken of, and the second we will speak of in a few moments, but if you weren't paying attention to his movements, you would think that Rakshas is a ball of black rags. A very deadly ball of black rags, but a ball of rags nonetheless. The only thing that even lets you know there's a person inside those rags is the mask of the Rakshas dons, and he's quite attached to it as well, we'll have you know. As an exile of the Bakiraka clan, he has intimate knowledge about various killing methods and world politics, but as an apostle, his knowledge of the astral world is of far more import to the story. Rakshas was able to deduce the nature of one of the grossest creations in all of Berserk in the blink of an eye, when most of his compatriots would have taken ages to even understand what they were seeing. As the leader of Griffith's Search and Destroy unit, he represents the unbridled bloodlust of an apostle, as the job of Rakshas's unit is to clean up battlefields and ensure there were no survivors, and his most recent actions in the manga saw him go up against and get blown in half by Rickard, the one guy who knows what the whole world doesn't about Griffith's true nature. Though we haven't seen him since he got hit with Rickard's bazooka, we expect Rakshas to surface at least once more before Berserk ends, because he still hasn't done what he said he will do in his first appearance. We need to see just how this apostle plans to kill a God Hand member when another couldn't, despite having the world's largest army at his disposal. And yes, we'll get to that character as well. Locus. We have a man who is quite possibly the only apostle who truly understands the full scope of Griffith's vision for the new world, though that still doesn't mean either him or his master are in the right. When the Falcon of Light besieges the midland city of Shet with nothing but a single immortal soldier, wink wink, Sir Locus is the first apostle to show up and pledge his allegiance to the savior of the world. Griffith recognizes the Moonlight Knight from his reputation and accepts his sword, granting Locus the position of his chief military spokesperson and the leader of his War Demon's Lancer unit. Like all other apostles gathered to their master's light, Locus too was driven by an instinctual sense of reverence for Griffith, but unlike them, he went a step beyond because he truly grasped the brilliance of his master's vision. In his human life, Sir Locus was one of Midland's most legendary knights. He had an undefeated jousting career and never took up with a single master for too long, choosing to lead a life of unending peregrination instead. Mule Wolflame grew up on stories about Locus the Moonlight Knight, and so he was confused to not only see him in the flesh, but also see him willingly work for someone else, given his reputation. But if you've seen our Locus Origins video, then you'll know that Griffith represents his idealized version of a leader worthy of his service. Locus truly thinks that the world the Falcon of Light is building is an inclusive utopia for all living things, humans and apostles included. He knows that as a God Hand incarnate, Griffith is the embodiment of the divine right of kings, and being an old school knight himself, Locus really values things like that, which is why it's going to be so interesting to see what his role in the endgame of Berserk ends up looking like. Locus has one of the most resplendent apostle forms we've come across so far. He looks like a centaur with a metallic armor covering his entire body, and a head like a massive cyberpunk-inspired visor. His lance is easily several feet tall, and seems to be capable of expanding and contracting according to Locus's will. His skill as a knight and his strength as an apostle have allowed him to live long enough to see his master remove the greatest magical obstacles from his path. But what will he do about the human ones? Locus was incredibly agitated after witnessing the slap of the millennium firsthand, and it's very possible that he was the one who sent Rakshas after Rickard. The former Falcon managed to escape, and because there were more pressing matters like hydras and giants on their docket, the band of the Falcon didn't see it fit to pursue Rickard and co. But they are fated to clash once again in the final arc of Berserk, and it will be interesting to see what Locus thinks of his master when all the cards are laid on the table. Griffith has already already sacrificed his lifelong comrades once for the sake of his dream. Who's to say he won't do it again? And especially to apostles who, for all their loyalty and uses, were inconsequential servants in the eyes of the God Hand. The Moonlight Knight seems to think his master had forged his kind into an iron fist that is unshakable, but desire is a treacherous mistress, and Sir Locus might be in for a rather rude betting ceremony. Egg of the perfect world. So far, every apostle we have spoken of had someone to sacrifice in order to reach their ascended state. Yes, even Wyald had someone who loved him and cared for him, because at the time of his ascension he was an old man. But what do you do when you have no one who cares for you, or even knows you in the world? You sacrifice the world itself, and that is exactly what this apostle did. The man who would go on to become the egg of the perfect world grew up in the shadow of the Tower of Conviction, scrounging through garbage dumps for as long as he could remember. He was ostracized and vilified for his inhuman appearance, and so he decided to isolate himself within a hole of his own creation. The more time he spent living, the deeper his hole became, until one day it was mistaken for a grave by the people who had settled around St. Albion. Crushed underneath the dead and decaying bodies of dozens of people, this nobody cried out a cry of despair that sounded like a newborn babe's first and a dying man's last. His despair activated the behelit he had in his possession, and he met the 5 angels who helped him perceive himself and the world around him for the first time. Nobody realized just how full of despair people really were with the lives they were currently leading, and so he decided he would sacrifice the world surrounding him in exchange for hatching the perfect world. Though he never kills a person with his own hands, the egg of the perfect world's actions led to the deaths of hundreds, if not thousands, of people in St. Albion. His Machiavellian machinations are what trigger the incarnation ceremony, and the tentacles that transformed the great goat and Mozgus and his disciples into pseudo-apostles belonged to him. The egg of the perfect world was unique in that he was the only apostle we've seen bearing a brand of sacrifice, and his body was shaped like an oversized behelit. The reason behind these peculiar design choices became crystal clear when, after swallowing the dying demon child, the egg of the perfect world becomes the incubation chamber for Femto's incarnation into the physical world as Griffith. In a way, everything that is happening in the story of Berserk right now is because of this nobody. His hatching marked the beginning of the end for the world of reason, and had he not swallowed the demon child, we would not get the Moonlight Boy today. The egg of the perfect world is the epitome of human beings and apostles mistaking the God Hand's curses as gifts and blindly following their orders like the good little sheep they are. Marvelous verdict. Thanks for watching and being patient with us through to the end of this list. Let us know in the comments who your favorite apostle is, and don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons, and share this video with your fellow strugglers if you like our content. This has been Corey Whelan for Marvelous Videos. Have a good one, be safe out there, and thanks for watching.